Maribel Cross had once believed that marriage was a careful weaving of patience and hope, a quiet promise that two people would protect each other even when the world pressed hard against them. She married Adrian Cross believing he saw her as an equal, someone whose voice mattered. Years later, on a rainy evening thick with unsaid words, Adrian sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "My mother's kidneys are failing. The doctors say she will need a transplant." His voice shook, but Maribel noticed how his eyes never quite met hers. When he added, almost casually, "You're a match," the room seemed to tilt. She folded her hands and asked softly, "Are you asking or are you telling me?" Adrian sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm asking, of course. Your family. You do this for family." The word family echoed strangely. Their marriage had already been strained by long silences, late nights, and a growing distance Maribel could not ignore. Still, she remembered the early days, when Adrian used to laugh easily and say, "We're a team, Mari. Always." That memory pushed her to nod. "I'll think about it," she said, choosing calm over confrontation. Later that night, alone in the bedroom, Maribel stared at the ceiling and whispered to herself, "I need to know the truth before I give anything." That was the first night she decided to listen more than she spoke. In the weeks that followed, Maribel moved through her days with careful attention, as if every small detail mattered. Adrian became suddenly attentive, bringing her tea and saying things like, "You're strong. I've always admired that about you." She answered politely, but watched closely. One afternoon, his phone buzzed while he showered. A name flashed across the screen. Elena. Maribel did not touch the phone. She did not need to. The pattern had already formed. Later, at dinner, she asked, "Who is Elena?" Adrian froze for half a second too long. "A colleague," he said quickly. "Why?" Maribel smiled faintly. "No reason." Inside, something settled into place, cold and clear. She began gathering information quietly. Bank statements, messages glimpsed at the edge of a screen, dates that did not line up. When Adrian talked about the transplant, she asked practical questions. "What does the doctor say about recovery?" she asked. "What are the risks?" He waved them away. "You'll be fine. People do this all the time." The way he said "you'll" made her chest tighten. She realized he spoke as if her body already belonged to the plan. At night, she wrote notes to herself. "Do not rush. Do not argue. Prepare." When Adrian kissed her forehead and said, "Everything will be okay once this is done," she replied, "Yes. Once everything is clear." The hospital smelled of disinfectant and quiet urgency. Maribel sat beside Adrian's mother, Lillian Cross, who squeezed her hand and whispered, "You're an angel, dear." Maribel smiled kindly. "I just want everyone to be well," she said, choosing her words carefully. In a small consultation room, Dr. Henson looked at her chart and asked, "Maribel, are you still comfortable proceeding as a donor?" Adrian answered too quickly, "Of course she is." Dr. Henson raised an eyebrow. "I need to hear it from her." The room went silent. Maribel felt Adrian's eyes on her, heavy with expectation. She took a breath and said, "Doctor, I need a moment alone." Adrian frowned. "What is this about?" She met his gaze steadily. "About my consent." When they were alone, she said clearly, "I am withdrawing." Dr. Henson nodded calmly. "That is your right." When Adrian was called back in, the doctor said, "The donor has chosen not to proceed." Adrian's face flushed. "What do you mean?" he demanded. Maribel stood up. "I mean my body is not something you can plan around without honesty." He hissed, "You can't do this to my mother." She replied evenly, "I didn't do this. Your choices did." For the first time in years, his voice broke. "You're ruining everything." Maribel picked up her bag. "No," she said. "I'm saving myself." After that day, Maribel moved with precision. She met with her lawyer, Denise Harper, who listened carefully and said, "You were wise to prepare." Maribel nodded. "I wanted to act, not react." Together, they froze joint accounts, reviewed the prenuptial agreement, and challenged a trust Adrian had quietly altered. When Adrian called, his messages shifted from anger to pleading. "Please talk to me," he said in one voicemail. In another, his voice cracked. "Elena means nothing. I made a mistake." Maribel deleted them without listening twice. Denise asked gently, "Do you want to confront him?" Maribel shook her head. Silence is clearer. News traveled quickly. Elena disappeared when the money vanished, leaving Adrian scrambling. He showed up once, standing at the door and saying, "We can fix this." Maribel replied through the closed door, "You can fix yourself." Lillian sent a letter, shaky handwriting asking for forgiveness. Maribel wrote back kindly but firmly, wishing her health without sacrifice. Each step felt heavy but right. At night, Maribel slept deeply for the first time in years, knowing she had chosen herself without cruelty. Months later, Maribel sat by her window watching the city move on, unchanged by her private war. She thought about what betrayal had taught her. Love, she realized, was never a debt to be collected. It was a gift freely given or not given at all. When friends asked how she found the strength, she said simply, "I stopped arguing with the truth." Adrian's last message went unanswered. The noise had faded, leaving clarity behind. Maribel touched her side and smiled faintly, aware not just of the kidney she had kept, but of the life she had reclaimed. She whispered to herself, "I belong to me." As weeks passed, Maribel began to notice how quiet her life had become, and how that quiet felt like healing instead of loneliness. One morning, her sister Paula called and asked, "Are you really okay?" Maribel laughed softly. "I'm more okay than I've been in years." Paula hesitated. "He told everyone you were cruel." Maribel replied calmly, "People can believe what helps them sleep." She spent her days reorganizing her home, removing objects that carried heavy memories. When she found an old photo of Adrian smiling beside her at the beach, she studied it and said aloud, "You were real once." She placed it in a box and closed the lid without anger. At a cafe later that afternoon, a stranger commented, "You look peaceful." Maribel smiled politely, surprised by how true it felt. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for an apology or an explanation. She was simply living. Adrian, however, was unraveling. He called Denise, Maribel's lawyer, demanding answers. "She can't just erase me," he said. Denise replied evenly, "She didn't erase you. She stepped away." When Adrian tried to reach Maribel through mutual friends, she gently but firmly declined contact. One friend asked, "Don't you want closure?" Maribel answered, "Closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you choose." Meanwhile, Lillian's health worsened and Adrian blamed the world. "She owed us," he muttered to his brother. His brother replied quietly, "No one owes you their body." Those words lingered, but Adrian brushed them aside, too consumed by regret to sit with truth. Maribel returned to work full-time, where her colleague Jonah noticed the change. "You're different," he said during lunch. "Lighter." Maribel shrugged. "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine." Jonah nodded thoughtfully. "That takes courage." She smiled. Courage, she realized, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It was the steady decision to keep going without needing applause. That evening, she signed the final divorce papers. When Denise slid them across the table, she asked, "Any second thoughts?" Maribel shook her head. "Only gratitude that I waited to decide." One unexpected night, Adrian showed up at the cafe where Maribel often read. He stood awkwardly and said, "Can we talk?" Maribel looked up, calm but guarded. "5 minutes," she said. He sat and whispered, "I didn't think you'd really leave." She replied, "That was the problem." He lowered his eyes. "I thought love meant forgiveness." Maribel answered gently, "Love also means respect." When the 5 minutes ended, she stood. "Take care of yourself," she said, and walked away before he could respond. Adrian watched her go, realizing too late that control had never been love. That night, Maribel journaled by candlelight, writing, "I did not destroy a family. I refuse to be destroyed." The words felt final and freeing. She thought about the hospital room, the doctor's calm voice, and how that moment had changed everything. It wasn't revenge. It was choice. She slept peacefully, knowing she had acted with dignity. Spring arrived, and with it new routines. Maribel joined a weekend hiking group. On the trail, someone asked, "What made you start?" She replied with a smile, "I wanted to feel my strength." Each step reminded her that her body was her own. She laughed more easily now, breathing deeply, unafraid of her own resilience. News eventually reached her that Adrian's mother had found another donor through a registry. Paula asked cautiously, "How do you feel about that?" Maribel thought for a moment. "Relieved," she said honestly. "No one had to suffer for me to be free." That realization settled any lingering guilt she hadn't known she carried. One evening, Maribel hosted dinner for close friends. Over wine, someone raised a toast. To Maribel, they said, for choosing herself. She laughed and replied, "To all of us, for learning when to walk away." The room filled with warmth, not pity, not drama, just respect. Alone later, Maribel reflected on how silence had protected her better than arguments ever could. She hadn't needed to shout or accuse. She had simply stepped back and let the truth speak. In doing so, she had reclaimed not only her future, but her voice. Adrian sent one last message months later. "I understand now." Maribel read it once and archived it. Understanding, she knew, was his journey, not hers. She closed her phone and went for a walk, the evening air cool against her skin. At a bookstore, she picked up a novel and overheard a couple arguing softly. She smiled to herself, not in judgment, but in recognition of how fragile trust could be when taken for granted. She paid for her book and left, grateful for her awareness. Time continued its quiet work. Maribel began mentoring younger women at her workplace, often saying, "Listen when something feels wrong." When one asked, "How do you know?" Maribel replied, "Your body knows before your heart catches up." On the anniversary of the hospital visit, Maribel lit a candle and said aloud, "Thank you for my courage." She no longer felt anger, only clarity. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. Standing by her window again, Maribel watched the city, lights flicker on. She thought about autonomy, about how easily it could be surrendered, and how fiercely it must be protected. She whispered, "I chose myself, not as a boast, but as a promise." And so her story ended not with noise or victory speeches, but with quiet strength. Maribel Cross kept her kidney, her name, and her sense of self. She moved forward knowing that love must always be free, never demanded, never traded. In choosing absence over spectacle, she had found her justice and her peace. Life did not suddenly become perfect for Maribel, but it became honest. Small challenges appeared, leaky faucets, long workdays, quiet weekends, but none of them felt overwhelming. One afternoon, her neighbor Mrs. Caldwell stopped her in the hallway and said, "You seem happier these days." Maribel smiled and answered, "I finally stopped pretending." They talked about simple things, weather and books, and Maribel noticed how grounding normal conversations could be. Happiness, she realized, was not excitement. It was stability. It was knowing that no one was quietly taking from her while smiling at her face. At work, Maribel was offered a leadership role on a new project. When her manager asked, "Do you feel ready for this responsibility?" Maribel answered without hesitation, "Yes." The certainty in her own voice surprised her. Later, she called Paula and said, "I said yes without fear." Paula laughed. "That's growth." Maribel agreed. For so long, fear had shaped her decisions, fear of conflict, fear of loss. Now, her choices were guided by clarity instead. She no longer needed permission to step forward. One quiet evening, Maribel ran into Adrian's brother at the grocery store. He hesitated, then said, "I wanted you to know you were right." Maribel nodded gently. "I hope he finds peace." The brother replied, "I think he's learning slowly." Maribel wished him well and walked away, feeling no pull to look back. Compassion, no longer meant sacrifice. It meant distance with dignity. As the year closed, Maribel took a short trip alone, something she had always postponed. Sitting by the water, she spoke softly to herself. You survived more than you knew. The waves answered with steady rhythm. She felt complete, not because someone chose her, but because she had chosen herself again and again. Maribel moved forward with a quiet confidence that did not seek validation. Her story was no longer about betrayal, marriage, or loss. It was about ownership of self. She had learned that autonomy is not taken in dramatic moments, but reclaimed in calm decisions. And in that calm, lasting space, Maribel finally lived free. With time, Maribel noticed that her memories of the past no longer arrived with sharp edges. They came like old letters, familiar, distant, and no longer demanding answers. One morning, while sorting through a drawer, she found her wedding ring. She held it for a moment and said quietly, "You represented a promise that changed." Instead of sadness, she felt understanding. She placed the ring in a small box and closed it, not as an ending, but as a record of what had been. At a community event, Maribel met a woman named Tessa who spoke openly about rebuilding her life after betrayal. Over coffee, Tessa asked, "How did you stay so calm?" Maribel replied, "I didn't stay calm. I learned to pause." Tessa nodded slowly. Pausing saved me too. Their conversation drifted into laughter, and Maribel realized how powerful shared honesty could be when it wasn't wrapped in drama. One evening, Paula visited and helped Maribel cook dinner. As they chopped vegetables, Paula said, "You don't flinch anymore when his name comes up." Maribel smiled. "Because it doesn't define me now." Paula leaned against the counter. "I'm proud of you." Maribel answered softly, "I'm proud of me too." The words felt strong, not arrogant, earned. Maribel began volunteering at a local support center, helping people organize paperwork during stressful transitions. When someone asked, "How do you stay so steady?" she said, "I learned the hard way that preparation is a form of self-respect." Watching others regain balance reminded her how far she had come. On a quiet Sunday, Maribel walked through a park filled with families and couples. She felt no envy, only curiosity about her own future. A passerby's child dropped a balloon, and Maribel helped retrieve it. The child smiled and said, "Thank you." That simple gratitude warmed her more than any grand gesture ever had. Late one night, Maribel wrote a letter she never intended to send. It said, "I forgive you, not to free you, but to free myself." She folded the paper and tucked it into her journal. Forgiveness, she understood, did not require reunion or explanation. At work, her project succeeded, and her team celebrated. Her manager said, "Your leadership made the difference." Maribel replied, "We all did our part." She had learned that confidence did not need to announce itself loudly. It simply showed up, consistent and reliable. When autumn arrived again, Maribel felt grateful rather than reflective. Seasons changed, and so had she. She bought a new coat, stood in front of the mirror, and laughed lightly. "You look like yourself," she said aloud. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the window, Maribel brewed tea and sat with a book. She thought about autonomy, not as a dramatic declaration, but as daily care. Choosing rest, choosing truth, choosing silence when noise would only harm. And so Maribel's journey continued, steady and grounded. Her story was no longer about what had been taken from her, but about what she protected and grew. With each quiet choice, she honored her body, her voice, and her future, knowing at last that peace was not found in sacrifice, but in self-trust. As another year unfolded, Maribel found comfort in routine. Every morning, she watered the small plants by her window, watching new leaves form where nothing had been before. One day, she caught herself thinking, this is how healing looks, slow, quiet, alive. At the market, a vendor asked, "Who are these flowers for?" Maribel answered with a soft smile, "For my home." Saying it out loud reminded her that her life no longer revolved around proving devotion. It revolved around care. During a long walk one evening, Paula asked, "Do you think you'll ever love again?" Maribel considered the question carefully. "Yes," she said at last, "but differently." Paula raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Maribel replied, "I won't disappear inside it." The answer felt honest, not defensive. Love, she had learned, should expand a person, not shrink them. Paula squeezed her hand. "That sounds healthy." Maribel nodded, feeling no rush toward anything, only openness. At a small gathering, someone asked Maribel to share advice for navigating difficult choices. She said simply, "Listen when your silence feels safer than your words." The room grew quiet, thoughtful. She hadn't planned to teach anyone, yet her experience carried weight. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. On a calm night, Maribel stood on her balcony, city lights glowing below. She breathed in deeply and felt fully present. There was no urge to look back, no need to prove how far she had come. Her strength was no longer a response to pain, it was a part of who she was. Maribel Cross closed this chapter of her life with grace rather than noise. She kept what was hers, her body, her boundaries, her future. The story did not end with triumph or loss, but with balance. And in that balance, Maribel lived on, whole, self-directed, and free.